The proceedings next day had all the cold vengefulness of a death sentence, or the cruelty of a sentence of exile. There were several questions before the court. The first, as to whether the ship was in every respect fit and seaworthy for the voyage. The court found she was not. The next point, whether up to the time of the accident the ship had been navigated with proper and seamanlike care. They said yes to that. Then they declared that there was no evidence to show the exact cause of the accident. A floating derelict, probably. Finally, in utter disregard of their plain duty, abandoning in the moment of danger the lives and property confided to their charge, the captain's and the mate's certificates to be cancelled. A silence fell, and then people started to move out. Jim passed me on his way to the gate, and I watched his back as he went away. Later, I caught sight of him leaning over the parapet of the quay. He didn't hear me come up. I don't remember what I said, not much, anyhow. But he made no difficulty in following me to the hotel. I steered him into my bedroom and sat down at once to write letters, so that he could have it out with himself with all possible privacy. I wrote and wrote. I liquidated all the arrears of my correspondence. I'd finished addressing the last envelope when I heard him ask, "May I have a cigarette?" I gave a push to the box without raising my head. He remained with his back to me for a time and then muttered, "I carried it off pretty well. Something's paid off, not much. Wonder what's to come." "Goodbye," he said with the sudden haste of a man who had lingered too long. He'd crossed the room and opened the door leading into the corridor before I leapt up from my chair. "Wait!" I cried. "You must let me help you." "You can't," he said very simply and gently. I said, "Look at this letter. I want you to take it to a man of whom I have never asked a favor. I'm writing about you in terms that one only ventures to use when speaking of an intimate friend. I make myself unreservedly responsible for you." He lifted his head. "Jove," he gasped out. "You are a brick. You have helped me, you have given me confidence," he declared soberly. "I always thought if a fellow could begin with a clean slate, and now you, in a measure..." "Yes, clean slate." He marched out without looking back. 6 months afterwards, my friend, he was a cynical, more than middle-aged bachelor with a reputation for eccentricity and owned a rice mill, wrote to me, judging from the warmth of my recommendation, that I would like to hear enlarged upon a little Jim's perfections. It seemed to me on reading this letter that my friend had found in his heart more than tolerance for Jim, that there were the beginnings of active liking. I made a trip to the northward, and when I returned I found another letter from my friend waiting for me. It was the first envelope I tore open. "There are no spoons missing, as far as I know. I haven't been interested enough to inquire. He's gone, leaving on the breakfast table a formal little note of apology which is either silly or heartless." I flung the letter aside and started looking through the batch on my table till I came upon Jim's handwriting. Would you believe it? 1 chance in 100. But it is always that 100th chance. That little second engineer of the Patna had turned up in a more or less destitute state and got a temporary job of looking after the machinery of the mill. "I couldn't stand the familiarity of the little beast," Jim wrote from a seaport 700 miles south of the place where he should have been in clover. "I am now for the time with Egstrom and Blake, as ship chandlers as their runner. For reference I gave them your name, which they know, of course, and if you could write a word in my favor, it would be a permanent employment." I wrote as desired. Before the end of the year, my new charter took me that way, and I had an opportunity of seeing him. He was still with Egstrom and Blake. "What have you got to say for yourself?" I asked. "Did the fellow blab or what?" He looked at me with a troubled smile. "Oh, no. He was most damnably mysterious and would wink at me in a respectful manner as much to say, 'We know what we know.' Infernally fawning and familiar. 'Don't you be uneasy, sir,' he'd say. 'I know a gentleman when I see one, and I know how a gentleman feels. I hope, though, you'll be keeping me on in this job. I had a hard time of it, too, along of that rotten old Patna racket.' Jove, it was awful. I knew Mr. Denver liked me. That's what made it so hard. Such a splendid man, more like a father. I would have had to tell him. I couldn't let it go on, could I? I preferred to go," he said slowly. After a pause, he went on. "They're very decent to me here. Blake's a little cad, but Egstrom's all right." I didn't see him again that trip, but on my next, I had a 6 months charter, I went up to the store. Egstrom, all smiles, advanced, extending a large, bony hand. "Glad to see you, Captain. Been thinking you were about due back here." "What do you say, sir?" "Oh, him. No, he's left us. Put us to great inconvenience, too. Used us badly, I must say. He left, let's see, the very day a steamer with returning pilgrims from the Red Sea put in here with 2 blades for a propeller gone. 3 weeks ago now." "Was something said about the Patna case?" I asked, fearing the worst. He looked at me as if I'd been a sorcerer. "Why, yes. How do you know?" "Some of them were talking about it here. There was a captain or 2, the manager of Vanlo's engineering shop at the harbour, 2 or 3 others, and myself. Jim was in here, too, having a sandwich and a glass of beer. By and by, Vanlo's manager began to talk about the Patna. What an old ruin she was, and mentioning her last voyage. Captain O'Brien of the Sarah W. Granger, a large, noisy old man, suddenly roared out, 'Skunks! It's a disgrace to human nature, that's what it is. I would despise being seen in the same room with one of those men. I wouldn't care to have them here myself, so you're quite safe in this room, Captain O'Brien,' says I. And then, sir, that blasted Jim, he puts down the sandwich he had in his hand and walks round the table to me. There was his glass of beer, poured out quite full. 'I'm off,' he says, just like that. 'It isn't 1:30 yet,' says I. 'You might snatch a smoke first.' I thought he meant it was time for him to go down to his work. When I understood what he was up to, thinks I to myself, a raise, is it? Can't get a man like that every day, you know, sir. 'All right,' says I. 'No need of all that fuss with me, Jimmy. Just mention your figure, anything in reason.' He looks at me as if he wanted to swallow something that's stuck in his throat. 'I can't stop with you.' 'What's the blooming joke?' I asks. He shakes his head, and I could see in his eye he was as good as gone already, sir. So I turned to him, and I slanged him till all was blue. 'What is it you're running away from?' I asked. 'Who's been getting at you? What scared you? This business ain't going to sink.' He gave a big jump. 'Goodbye,' he says, nodding at me like a lord. 'You ain't half a bad chap, Egstrom. I'll give you my word that if you knew my reasons, you wouldn't care to ask me. Haven't been able to get a man that was any good since. A regular devil for a sailing boat, ready to go out miles to sea to meet ships in any sort of weather. I tell you, Captain Marlowe, nobody had a chance against us with a strange ship when Jim was about. And where might you have come across him, Captain, if it's fair to ask?' 'He was the mate of the Patna that voyage,' I said, feeling that I owed some explanation. For a time, Egstrom remained very still with his fingers plunged in the hair at the side of his face, and then exploded. 'And who the devil cares about that?' Then he exclaimed, 'Gee!' And I told him the earth wouldn't be big enough to hold his caper. There were many other episodes of this sort, all equally tinged with a high-minded absurdity of intention which made their futility profound and touching. I could never make up my mind whether his line of conduct amounted to shirking his ghost or to facing him out. After a time, Jim became known and even notorious within the circle of his wanderings as a rolling stone. For instance, in Bangkok, where he found employment with Yucca brothers, charterers and teak merchants, it was almost pathetic to see him go about in sunshine hugging his secret, which was known to the very up-country logs on the river. Schomburg, the keeper of the hotel where he boarded, a hirsute Alsatian of manly bearing and irrepressible retailer of all the scandalous gossip of the place, would, with both elbows on the tables, impart an adorned version of the story to any guest who cared to imbibe knowledge along with the more costly liquors. And mind you, the nicest fellow you could meet, would be the generous conclusion. Quite superior. It says a lot for the casual crowd that frequented Schomburg's establishment that Jim managed to hang out in Bangkok for a whole 6 months. Unfortunately, one evening an unpleasant affair took place in the hotel when a first lieutenant in the Royal Siamese Navy made some scornful remark at Jim's expense, and Jim chucked him in the river, which flowed below the hotel veranda. He turned up at about midnight on board my ship. "Everybody in the room seemed to know," he said, gasping. Naturally, after this, he couldn't remain in the place, and I took him away in my ship. I placed him with de Jong in Samarang as a water clerk. It was a mode of life barren of consolation and incapable of being invested with a spark of glamour. One day, coming ashore, I saw him standing on the quay, and after exchanging greetings, he said suddenly, "Jove, this is killing work." "Would you like," said I, "to leave this part of the world altogether? Try California or the West Coast. I'll see what I can do." He interrupted me a little scornfully. "What difference would it make?" I felt at once convinced he was right. What he wanted was something in the nature of an opportunity, not merely opportunities to earn his bread. The position struck me as hopeless, and Brearley's saying recurred to me. Let him creep 20 feet underground and stay there. Better that, I thought, than this waiting above ground for the impossible. There and then I made up my mind to go and consult Stein, a wealthy and respected merchant who had a large inter-island business with a lot of trading posts established in the most out-of-the-way places. He was one of the most trustworthy men I'd ever known, and possessed a boldness of spirit and physical courage that could only have been called reckless had it not been like a natural function of the body. He was also a naturalist of some distinction, or perhaps I should say a learned collector. Entomology was his special study. I considered him an eminently suitable person to receive my confidences about Jim's difficulties. When I entered his study that evening, Stein welcomed me in his quiet and humorous voice. Glass cases containing his collection of butterflies were ranged in 3 long rows upon slender-legged little tables. One of these cases had been removed from its place and stood on the desk, which was bestrewn with oblong slips of paper, blackened with minute handwriting. "The work," he said, pointing to the scattered slips, "is making great progress. I have been this rare specimen describing." His hand hovered over the case where a butterfly in solitary grandeur spread out dark bronze wings 7 inches or more across with exquisite white veinings and a gorgeous border of yellow spots. "And what is the good news?" "To tell you the truth, Stein," I said with an effort that surprised me, "I came here to describe a specimen." "Butterfly?" he asked with an unbelieving, humorous eagerness. "Nothing so perfect," I answered, feeling suddenly dispirited with all sorts of doubts. "A man." "Ach, so," he murmured, and his smiling countenance turned to me, became grave. Then after looking at me for a while, he said slowly, "Well, I am a man too." He heard me out, and when I had finished, he said, "I understand very well. He is romantic. He had diagnosed the case for me, and at first I was startled. It seemed natural to ask, "What's good for it?" He lifted up a long forefinger. "There is only one remedy. One thing alone can for us from being ourselves cure." There was a pause. "Yes," said I. "Strictly speaking, the question is not how to get cured, but how to live." He approved. A little sadly, it seemed. Yeah, that is the question. How to be. Ach, how to be. Then he shook his head slowly, and afterwards looked at me with a patient and inquiring glance. "We must put our heads together to find a practical remedy. Tonight you sleep here, and tomorrow we must do something practical. Practical." At breakfast next morning, I quoted Browley's remark, "Let him creep 20 feet underground and stay there." Stein looked up at me with interested attention. "This could be done," he remarked, sipping his coffee. "Bury him in some way," I explained. "One doesn't like to do it, of course, but it would be the best thing, seeing what he is." "There's Patjusin, and the woman is dead now," he added incomprehensibly. The only woman that had ever existed for Stein was the Malay girl he had called my wife, the princess, or more rarely in moments of expansion, the mother of my Emma. Who was the woman he had mentioned in connection with Patterson? I can't say, but from his allusions I understood she had been an educated and very good-looking Dutch Malay girl with a tragic history, whose most painful part was her marriage with a Malacca Portuguese, one Cornelius, who had been clerk in some commercial house in the Dutch colonies, an unsatisfactory person in more ways than one. It was solely for his wife's sake that Stein had appointed him manager of Stein & Co.'s trading post in Patterson, but commercially the arrangement was not a success, at any rate for the firm. And now the woman had died, Stein was disposed to try another agent there. It was this man Jim would relieve. "But I don't think Cornelius will leave the place, as I think there is a daughter left. I shall let him, if he likes to stay, keep the old house." Patterson is a remote district of a native-ruled state, and the chief settlement bears the same name. Stein's firm was the only one to have an agency by special permit from the Dutch authorities. The government trusted his discretion, and it was understood that he took all the risks. He was perfectly frank with me. As far as he was aware, utter insecurity for life and property was the normal condition. There were in Patterson antagonistic forces, and one of them was Raja Alang, the worst of the Sultan's uncles, the governor of the river, who did the extorting and the stealing and ground down to the point of extinction the country-born Malays. Neither Stein nor I had a clear conception of what might be on the other side when we, metaphorically speaking, took Jim up and hove him over the wall with scant ceremony. At the moment, I merely wished to achieve his disappearance. He wanted a refuge, and refuge at the cost of danger should be offered him, nothing more. I was perfectly frank with him, and as I unfolded our scheme for his retreat, his stubborn but weary resignation was gradually replaced by surprise, interest, wonder, and by boyish eagerness. This was a chance he'd been dreaming of. He couldn't think how he merited it. I told him that Stein was passing on to a young man the help he had received in his own young days, and I had done no more than to mention his name. Finally, I suggested he jumped into the first gharry he could see and drive on to Stein's house for his instructions. He did not return till next morning. He'd been kept to dinner and for the night. He had in his pocket a letter for Cornelius, and he exhibited with glee a silver ring, such as natives use, worn down, very thin, and showing faint traces of chasing. This was his introduction to an old chap called Doramin, one of the principal men out there, a big pot, who had been Mr. Stein's friend in that country and had given him the ring. They had exchanged presents when they parted for the last time, sort of promising eternal friendship. He impressed, almost frightened me with his elated rattle. "Slam the door! I've been waiting for that. I'll show. I'm ready for any confounded thing. I've been dreaming of it. Jove, get out of this, Jove. This is luck at last. You wait, I'll..." There was the sense of such exultation in a man appointed to be a trading clerk, and in a place where there was no trade at that. He flew into sudden activity. "Jove, 2 o'clock, and I sail at 4. It was true. A brigantine of Stein's was leaving for the westward that afternoon, and he had been instructed to take his passage in her. 2 years later, I visited Jim. The coast of Patusan is straight and sombre, and faces a misty ocean. Red trails are seen like cataracts of rust, streaming under the dark green foliage of bushes and creepers, clothing the low cliffs. Swampy plains open out at the mouths of rivers, with a view of jagged blue peaks beyond the vast forests. At a point on the river about 40 miles from the sea, where the first houses come into view, there can be seen rising above the level of the forests the summits of 2 steep hills very close together and separated by a narrow ravine. The appearance from the settlement is of an irregularly conical hill split in 2, and with the 2 halves leaning slightly apart. There is a village of fisher folk at the mouth of the Batu Kring branch of the estuary. The river, which had been closed so long, was open then, and Stein's little schooner, in which I had made my passage, worked her way up without being exposed to a fusillade from irresponsible parties. Such a state of affairs belonged already to ancient history, if I could believe the elderly headman of the fishing village who came on board to act as a sort of pilot. Most of his talk was about the first white man he had ever seen. He called him Tuan Jim, and the tone of his reference was made remarkable by a strange mixture of familiarity and awe. They, in the village, were under the Lord's special protection, which showed that Jim bore no grudge. Jim's coming to that fishing village was a blessing, but to them, as to many of us, the blessing came heralded by terrors. The appearance of the being that descended upon them and demanded inflexibly to be taken up to Patusan was discomposing. His insistence was alarming, his generosity more than suspicious. It was an unheard-of request. There was no precedent. What would the Rajah say to this? What would he do to them? The best part of the night had been spent in consultation, but the immediate risk from the anger of that strange man seemed so great that at last a cranky dugout had been got ready. Jim had sat in it on his tin box nursing an unloaded revolver. All the movement he had dared to allow himself had been to reach, as it were by stealth, after the shell of half a coconut floating between his shoes, and bail out some of the water with a carefully restrained action. Between whiles he speculated hazily as to the size of the blister the sun was raising on his back, and longed for sunset. Meantime his 3 paddlers were preparing to put into execution their plan of delivering him up to the Rajah. Jim supposed he must have been stupid with fatigue, or perhaps had dozed off for a time, because the first thing he knew was his canoe coming to the bank. He became instantaneously aware of the forest having been left behind, of the first houses being visible higher up, of a stockade on his left, and of his boatmen leaping out upon a low point of land and taking to their heels. He heard excited shouts, a gate swung open, and a lot of people poured out, making towards him. At the same time, a boat full of armed men appeared on the river and came alongside his empty canoe, thus shutting off his retreat. He saw some scoundrels going off with his box, and a long-legged old rogue, one Kasim, ran out fussing about the Rajah wanting to see him. Jim had replied, "All right, I too want to see the Rajah," and he simply walked through the gate. The main object of my visit was to tell him that it was Stein's intention to present him at once with the house, a very fine house in the native style, and the stock of trading goods on certain easy conditions, and he now looked with an owner's eye at the peace of the evening. It was something to be proud of. He had proved his grasp of the unfamiliar situation. He was not eloquent, but there was a dignity in his reticence about the work which had given him the certitude of rehabilitation. He confessed to me that he loved to see people go to sleep under his eyes, confident in the security of tomorrow. "Peaceful here, eh?" he asked. "Look at these houses. There's not one where I'm not trusted. Ask any man, woman, or child. This is where I was prisoner for 3 days," he murmured to me on the occasion of our visit to the Rajah, while we were making our way slowly across Tunku Alang's courtyard. "Filthy place, isn't it?" When we came into the presence, he became unflinchingly grave and complimentary with his late captor. The old, disreputable Tunku Alang could not help showing his fear towards his late prisoner. Jim, as far as I could follow the conversation, was improving the occasion by the delivery of a lecture. Some poor villagers had been waylaid and robbed while on their way to Doramin's house with a few pieces of gum or beeswax which they wished to exchange for rice. Jim enlarged upon the text that no man should be prevented from getting his food and his children's food honestly. The other sat like a tailor at his board, one palm on each knee, his head low, fixing Jim through the grey hair that fell over his eyes. When Jim had done, there was a great stillness. Nobody seemed to breathe even. No one made a sound till the old Rajah sighed faintly, and looking up with a toss of his head said quickly, "You hear, my people. No more of these little games." We were then presented with 2 cups of coffee on a brass tray. "You needn't drink," muttered Jim very rapidly. I didn't perceive the meaning at first. He took a good sip and sat composedly holding the saucer in his left hand. "Why the devil," I whispered, smiling at him amiably, "do you expose me to such a stupid risk?" I drank, of course. Almost immediately afterwards we took our leave. Jim said he was sorry. Personally, he thought nothing of poison, the remotest chance. He was, he assured me, considered to be infinitely more useful than dangerous, and so... "But the Rajah is afraid of you abominably. Anybody can see that," I argued. "If I'm to do any good here and preserve my position, I must stand the risk. I take it once a month at least. Many people trust me to do that for them. Afraid of me? That's just it. Most likely he is afraid of me because I'm not afraid of his coffee." Jim told me that the deliberations upon his fate had gone on night and day. He wandered about the courtyard, watched by all. Now and again some fussy ass deputed from the council room would come running out to him, and in honeyed tones would administer amazing interrogatories. He knew that the position was intolerable, and when his eyes fell on the broken stakes of the palisade, he set about his escape as if executing a plan matured for a month. He walked off carelessly to give himself a good run, and then went over like a bird. The first houses of Patusan were before him 400 yards away. He saw the creek and put on more pace. He took off from the last dry spot and landed in an extremely soft and sticky mudbank. The higher, firm ground was about 6 feet in front of him. He struck out, madly scattering the mud with his fists, and after tremendous efforts that seemed to burst his eyeballs and losing his shoes, he felt himself creeping feebly up the bank. The first houses were now not more than 20 yards away, and he pelted straight on in his socks, beplastered with filth. He clambered in desperation over a barricade of felled trees, burst through a fence into a maize patch, blundered upon a path, and ran into the arms of several startled men. He just had breath enough to gasp out, "Doramin! Doramin!" He was half carried, half run up to a large man sitting massively in a chair in the midst of the greatest possible commotion and excitement. He fumbled in mud and clothes to produce the ring. He was safe. Doramin's people were barricading the gate and pouring water down his throat. Doramin's old wife, full of business and commiseration, was issuing shrill orders to her girls. "The old woman," he said softly, "made a to-do over me as if I had been her own son." Doramin was the chief of the second power in Patusan, the immigrants from Celebes, the Bugis, who could muster some 200 men. They formed the party opposed to Raja Alang, whose cruelty and rapacity had no other bounds than his cowardice. And he was afraid of the organized power of the Bugis, though till Jim came, he was not afraid enough to keep quiet. The situation was complicated by a wandering stranger, an Arab half-breed who had established himself in a fortified camp on the summit of one of the twin hills. He hung over the town of Patusan like a hawk over a poultry yard, but he devastated the open country. The two parties in Patusan were not sure which one this partisan most desired to plunder. The Raja intrigued with him feebly. Some of the Bugis settlers, weary with endless insecurity, were half inclined to call him in to drive the Raja Alang out of the country. Doramin restrained them with difficulty. Doramin was one of the most remarkable men of his race. His bulk, for a Malay, was immense. But he didn't look merely fat. He looked imposing, monumental. He was never known to raise his voice. It was generally believed that he consulted with his wife as to public affairs, but nobody had ever heard them exchange a single word. The son of these old people was a most distinguished youth, Dane Warris. He was 4 or 25, had a proud carriage, a polished, easy bearing, and a temperament like a clear flame. His dusky face with big black eyes was in action expressive, and in repose thoughtful. He was of silent disposition. A firm glance, an ironic smile, a courteous deliberation of manner seemed to hint at great reserves of intelligence and power. "He is," said Jim, "the best friend, barring you, I ever had." Theirs was one of those strange, profound, rare friendships in which the very difference of race seems to draw two human beings closer by some mystic element of sympathy. When Jim arrived, the Bugis community was in a most critical position, and he could see plainly that something must be done at once. When he could spare the time from the investigation of Stein's affairs, he devised an audacious plan. He had then to inspire with his own confidence a lot of people who had hidden and absurd reasons for hanging back. He had to conciliate jealousies and argue away all sorts of senseless mistrusts. Without the weight of Doramin's authority and his son's fiery enthusiasm, he would have failed. Jim took me to the top of one of the twin summits. On the other hill, 200 yards across a somber precipice, a line of high blackened stakes showed here and there the remnants of Sharif Ali's one impregnable camp. Jim told me how he planned to take this camp. He had mounted Doramin's old ordnance on the top of the hill on which we were sitting, 2 rusty iron 7-pounders and a lot of small brass cannon, currency cannon. But if the brass guns represented wealth, they could also, when crammed recklessly to the muzzle, send a solid shot to some little distance. The thing was how to get them up there. He explained how he had improvised a rude capstan out of a hollowed log, turning upon a pointed stake. He had induced a war party to work hard all night, and had himself kept on rushing down and climbing up the steep slopes like a squirrel, directing, encouraging, watching all along the line. Old Doramin had himself carried up the hill in his armchair. They put him down on the level place upon the slope, and he sat there in the light of one of the big fires with a pair of immense flintlock pistols on his knees. "He'd come up there to die if anything went wrong," said Jim. "It thrilled me to see him there, like a rock. But the Sharif must have thought us mad and never troubled to come and see how we got on. Nobody believed it could be done." It appears that the success in mounting the guns had given Jim's people such a feeling of confidence that he ventured to leave the battery under the charge of 2 elderly Bugis who had seen some fighting in their day, and went to join Dane Warris and the storming party who were concealed in the ravine. In the small hours, they began creeping up, and when 2/3 of the way up, lay in the wet grass, waiting for the appearance of the sun, which was the agreed signal. Gradually, the silent stockade came out on the sky above him, and with the first slant of sun rays along the immovable treetops, the summit of one hill wreathed itself, with heavy reports in white clouds of smoke, and the other burst into an amazing noise of yells, war cries, shouts of anger, of surprise, of dismay. Jim and Dane Warris were the first to lay their hands on the stakes. The third man in had been Tambi Tamb, Jim's own servant. He was a Malay from the north, a stranger who had wandered into Patusan and had been forcibly detained by Raja Alang as a paddler of one of the state boats. He'd made a bolt of it at the first opportunity and had attached himself to Jim's person. There was something excessive, almost fanatical in his devotion to his white lord. The rout had been complete. Doramin, waiting immovably in his chair on the hillside, with the smoke of the gun spreading slowly above his big head, received the news with a deep grunt. When informed that his son was safe, he shuffled with great dignity into a bit of shade, where he laid himself down to sleep. In Patusan, the excitement was intense, and the air was filled with the tremendous din of gongs and drums and the wild shouts of the crowd. The defeated Sharif Ali fled the country without making another stand, and when the miserable hunted villagers began to crawl out of the jungle back to their rotting houses, it was Jim who, in consultation with Dane Warris, appointed the head men. Thus he became the virtual ruler of the land. As to old Tunku Alang, his fears at first had known no bounds. He could see himself driven ignominiously out of Patusan, wandering, abandoned, stripped, without opium, without his women, without followers, a fair game for the first comer to kill. After Sharif Ali, his turn would come, and who could resist an attack led by such a devil? And indeed, he owed his life, and such authority as he still possessed at the time of my visit, to Jim's idea of what was fair alone. The Bugis had been extremely anxious to pay off old scores, and the impassive old Doramin cherished the hope of yet seeing his son ruler of Patusan. He had an unbounded confidence in Tuan Jim's wisdom, but he was anxious about the future of the country. The land, he argued, remains where God put it. But white men come to us, and in a little while they go away back to their own lands, to their people. So this white man too would... No, no, I said vigorously. The extent of my indiscretion became apparent when Doramin said reflectively that this was good news indeed, and then wanted to know why. I was completely unprepared for this, and could only mutter and shake my head vaguely. He was not very pleased, I fear, and evidently I had given him food for thought. In the course of my voyage to Patusan, while talking casually with the people of the little native court of a place some 230 miles south of Patusan River, I discovered that a story was travelling slowly down the coast about a mysterious white man in Patusan who had got hold of an extraordinary gem. Such a jewel, it was said, was best preserved by being concealed about the person of a woman, and such a woman seemed to be actually in existence, a tall girl, whom the white man treated with great respect and care, and who never went forth from the house unattended. People said the white man could be seen with her almost any day. There could be no doubt she wore the white man's jewel concealed upon her bosom. This was the theory of Jim's marital evening walks. Romance had singled Jim for its own, and that was the true part of the story, which otherwise was all wrong. He did not hide his jewel. In fact, he was extremely proud of it. The girl was the daughter of the wife of the unspeakable Cornelius, by her previous marriage. And when she came into Jim's life, he called her by a word that means precious, in the sense of a precious gem, jewel. I heard the name 10 minutes after I had landed in his courtyard, when, after nearly shaking my arm off, he darted up the steps and began to make a joyous, boyish disturbance at the door under the heavy eaves. "Jewel! Oh, Jewel, quick! Here's a friend come!" This girl had an even, olive pallor, gleaming blue-black hair flowing abundantly from under a small crimson cap worn far back on her shapely head. Her movements were free, assured, and she blushed a dusky red. She gave an impression of grace and charm and a distinct suggestion of watchfulness. Her manner presented a curious combination of shyness and audacity. Every pretty smile was succeeded swiftly by a look of silent, repressed anxiety, as if put to flight by the recollection of some abiding danger. Jim had left Ormonde's place very soon after his arrival. He was actuated by a sense of duty. He had to look after Stein's business, and to that end, with an utter disregard of his personal safety, he crossed the river and took up his quarters with Cornelius.